Okay, so for this ENIGMA-U module, we're going to be a continuation of our discussion of ethical issues in behavioral science, with the first covering IRB and consenting. Now we want to talk about data management and privacy. So this is sort of, you've designed your study, you've moved to data collection, and now what are some of the considerations with how to handle data? And some of what we'll go through is very consistent across IRBs, and some you need to consult with your IRB. So once I collect data from my study participant, can I guarantee confidentiality to that subject as part of the consenting process? And this is a critical issue. It's one that we make every effort to guarantee, but ultimately we cannot guarantee full stop that a server couldn't be breached or something wouldn't happen so that the data could be made public. However, we can report to participants the ways in which we strive and we work to make sure that the data that we have collected with regard to their participation remains private. So to maximize confidentiality, how do we do this? And where, for just as a beginning point, where do we keep the data? And so this will depend a little bit on the IRB, but typically what we want is data to be maintained without identifiers and separate, in a separate file from any identifiers. Identifiers being name, date of birth, sex, etc. So your scores or your serum values or your imaging data or whatever you have should be the participant should be assigned to a number. That number goes with the data, and that is completely separate from any identifiers. In a separate file, you have the number with the identifiers. So in order for there to be a breach of confidentiality, an individual would have to have access to both of those files. You also want, in any of your files, two quote-unquote locked doors. And these used to be physically locked doors or cabinet doors. So you'd have an outside door to the lab and then a cabinet door. But now this could take the form of different passwords. But you want two levels of protection. So if even somebody gets through one, there remains some door or quote-unquote lock or password on the data. And so there could be a password-protected server or a password-protected document, for example. Ultimately, the requirements for data security come down to what is stipulated by the IRB. So when you submit your protocol, you will, the IRB, you can have discussions with the IRB about requirements for data management and security. One question that comes up is, as an investigator, so I'm the investigator, the participants signed the consent. Now they are, quote unquote, my data. And this is something that'll come up later. Whose data is it? Can I release these data to anyone? And the answer is no. The only way that a piece of information collected from someone could be released, even to a family member, is if, in the case of a study where it's a minor and the parent also signed, which they should, then it could be released to a parent. Or if the participant signs a release saying, yes, you can share my information. As a subject or a volunteer in a study, can I release my data to anyone? And the answer is mostly yes, although there may be some situations where a participant was part of a study that the data need to be maintained for a certain window of time, or it would disrupt the study, or they could have themselves removed from the study, but to share the data, there may be sort of windows of time where they would be asked to wait. There are some situations where a subject may not release their own data, but most of the time the answer is yes. So moving from specific scenarios to broader ethical implications, there are a number of frameworks that think about data management, security. And so just one example is by Du Bois in 2008. We want to think a little bit about the SFNO. So it would be the stakeholders, the facts, the norms, and the options. And so this is just sort of an acronym to help you think about, or an abbreviation to help you think about who's affected by the decision, what facts generate disagreement, and what are the conflicts, what are the norms or the values, what are the standards, and what are the actions or policies that we should be considering when taking action. And so in the case of data ownership, so you conducted your study, you collected it, you analyzed it. Is it your data, like I said just a moment ago? In many scenarios, especially related to big data and emergency tech, they're still developing standards regarding data ownership. So just as one example, if I take a picture of you, it's my picture. Now, this doesn't apply, of course, to pictures that would be taken if you don't know, or if you're in a private setting where it would be illegal. But in a typical situation where I take a picture and maybe you're in the background, or you posed for a picture, that I now own that picture. So now I cannot use, there's limits on that. I can't use that photo to imply an endorsement. For example, put you next to a product and claim that you endorse that product. And again, I can't take that photo in a private situation or anything that would be an invasion of your privacy. So something else to consider is that you don't actually have to be the creator to own the data. And so there are a number of crowdsourced data collection services that make use of what is available publicly. They pull it together and then they provide concatenated or aggregated data that you can use, like in Wikipedia, something like Rotten Tomatoes, where they take all the publicly available scores for movies and put them in one place. So each of the individual data points are somebody else's observations but in some ways those are a piece of data. They're put together. Now you can kind of create your own data with them. So in that sense, you didn't write the original review for Rotten Tomatoes or whatever the service, but you can take that review, aggregate it with other reviews, and now you have your own data. That's permissible. And the justification for ownership here is the effort to pull all of those data together. But when you think about data ownership in your own research, who can possess, who can publish, it's complicated because ultimately, again, we're going back to the thinking of, I collected the data, I analyzed the data, it's my data, right? Well, if you're at an institution, there's a sponsoring institution that turned the lights on and gave you a computer. There's the funding agency that perhaps paid the stipends for the volunteers. Then there's the principal investigator, and perhaps you're a postdoc or somebody working with the principal investigator. There's all sorts of other investigators, and they all have their own motivations and interests. And then there's also human subjects who are part of the study and gave you their information. Is it really still their information ultimately? Or any other sort of non-governed entity, something like Facebook. So who owns the data is somewhat unclear. And you, at some institutions, if it was a funded grant at that institution and you leave, the data will stay there. And in other places, other situations, the data can come with you. So this is something to always keep in mind when you aim to publish a paper or you aim to analyze a data set, or be mindful of whose data do these belong to? Can I take action? Can I analyze and publish using them without consultation with other people? And it can be complicated. So don't be afraid to take a step back, talk to people who are familiar with the data set, including your PI or others, just to make sure that what you're engaging in is verified by anybody who was involved, that is, in the original study. One other thing we should do is broaden our definition of data. And so it's not just results of your experiment, it's the materials, the means, and products. So study design documents, the instruments, the collected individual data points, the code, which is really underrated. All of the code that goes into analyses, that is, and it's in essence, a big part of the data stream. Aggregated data, and of course, the findings. So maintaining confidentiality is an ultimate goal in ethical science. It's something we really need to be doing. However, sharing data is in academia's best interest, and so protecting private information is non-trivial. It is a critical issue. It's something we always have to be thinking about. In particular, the richer the data set, the more information in the data with regard to with respect to the complexity of the data. whether it just be if it's a single number versus if it's an MRI with blood values and other behavioral characteristics that could be identifying, we need to always keep that in mind. And so removing the IDs and the names doesn't always solve the problem. And for example, this is a graduate student of mine who agreed she's fine with me using this image. And we typically think of, well, it's an image of the brain, and so that's de-identified. But if there's a profile there and there's a face, and before, of course, there are steps in imaging data analysis that can remove all of that additional context. But at its core, in its raw form, this does exist. And so when I share data, I have to keep in mind the richer that data set, the more information there is there, the harder it is to protect privacy. So one question is, if anonymization is hopeless, should we give up on sharing? And that's really not the answer. The goal for this module is definitely not to dissuade anybody from sharing data. Team science, transparency, and data sharing is I personally think, and I think I'm not alone, it's an important part of the future of science in across disciplines. And just as one example, if you visit Databrary, this group of scientists has been able to share video, which is very rich data, of children, which we commonly have significant concerns about sharing information about. And so it's video of kids in order to develop normative standards for different cognitive behavioral profiles. And these are openly available. But they've been able to do it in a very careful way. They've been doing it, these investigators have been able to do it in a way that makes it possible for us to share really rich data. And we see this also in large scale studies across the country, the ABCD study, and which is a developmental study across a decade of life and following 10,000 children for over a decade, and with a range of many different tests, including genetics, neuropsychological, behavioral, and health assessments. And so these data can be shared, they can be publicly available, but we need to be very careful with how we guarantee access, how the information in particular de-identified on the front end so that none of these children can be identified from the data. So let's go through, given what I've said, just a couple of examples. And after I read each example, I'll pause, or I'll pause for a second, but you can also hit the pause button so you can think about what the dilemma is, and then I'll provide some of my insights. So in case one, a graduate student meets an established researcher at a conference. The researcher expressed interest in the student's work and asks the student to share the results. Returning home, the student emails the original data to the researcher. On learning of this, the student's advisor says, "Oh no, shouldn't have done that." The student responds that he read on the NIH website that data sharing is important to the responsible conduct of science. So go ahead and pause, or if you want to think, or if you already know the answer, you don't need to. So this is sort of a tricky issue. We do really want to advocate for data sharing, and the student, and within the spirit of that, is not wrong. However, again, the question always should be sort of lingering in a little bubble, above your head. Is like, whose data are these, and can they be shared? And hopefully the answer is yes. But what is the process for sharing them? What kind of agreements do we need to have in place between institutions? It may be the case that for those data, the consent forms didn't allow for data sharing. The participants who signed off said, I'm sorry, I don't want my data shared. Or maybe only a part of the data can be shared. So all of these things need to be worked out through user agreements between institutions. And once they are, then data can move and be shared, and really great science can happen. But in this case, the student was just a little too quick. Case two, a young assistant professor publishes a study that draws conclusions different from those of a prominent senior researcher. A few weeks later, she receives an email from a senior researcher complimenting her on the publication and asking that she share the data so that they can try to model them. Fearing that the modeling will show that her published conclusions are wrong, the assistant professor ignores the email. So pause if you want to think about that. So this is also a tricky one. Yes, most ethical dilemmas are, the word dilemma is an ethical dilemma, right? So if it was obvious, then they wouldn't be hard. The the concern here for the assistant professor is that some of the work going on may not be replicated. It may not be confirmed, and that could affect her career. So nobody has to share. But in particular, this is this is one of the reasons why often individuals won't share, is that there's concern. I mean, there are a number of reasons why sharing may or may not happen. But one is that there's concern that the findings can't be repeated, can't be replicated. So in this case, does the assistant professor, must the assistant professor share? Not necessarily, but I would hope in this situation she might reconsider that this opens up a collaboration, an opportunity to build new science, to test different positions, because ultimately supporting one theory over the other is not really the goal. It's to advance our understanding of the phenomenon. And so I hope that there would be reconsideration here. And then finally, a postdoctoral student, Alex, is part of a research team that spent several years collecting a large data set. Alex earns co-authorship on one publication before leaving to accept a tenure-line faculty position. After settling in, Alex contacts the postdoctoral supervisor and asks for access to the data set to work on additional publications. The supervisor responds that the data must stay in the laboratory and that only current students and postdocs are allowed to have access. How would you advise the former student, or what might that student do? So pause if you want to think about that. Excuse me. So this is a tricky and unfortunately not all that uncommon scenario where somebody who's part of a project, whether it be a postdoc or a graduate student or even a research assistant, part of it really could be deeply involved in a project, but then moves on with their career or even moves on to another phase of their life outside of academia. But then has some intuition, some ideas about how those data might be used, what might be analyzed, and would like to continue on the project. And that's not always possible. Excuse me. Ultimately, this is up to the lab advisor. However, given the involvement of this student, given that this individual, Alex, spent several years involved in collecting this large data set, it would be reasonable for Alex to request to continue collaborating, even if it's the students and postdocs in the lab continue, that Alex still have an opportunity to continue to collaborate with the lab, even though this individual is now in a different setting. Ultimately, I do think that the advisor can say no. It would be an unfortunate situation, and I think that it's not entirely uncommon, but I think a strong relationship between advisor and postdoctoral student and a good conversation here could hopefully open up opportunity for ongoing collaboration. So what are the considerations for data management and sharing? We want to consider, do I have permission to share the data? Is this something that, for example, do I need an MOU, or is that required by my institution, a contract that allows for the data to be shared? And what are the limits to data being shared? Perhaps it's only part of a data set, it's one data type. In respect to publication, who are the stakeholders that require consultation? Who was involved from the beginning of the study that perhaps should be part of the decision with regard to publication? And so those are all some of the issues that come up with respect to data and privacy. So not only privacy on the front end, guaranteeing that data remain confidential, but then with respect to sharing, making sure that all the institutional governances are considered, but also those involved in the study over the history of study. Some studies can last quite a long period of time. Okay, and that's it for this module.